David Coletto, first of all, good to see you again.
Good to see you, Peter.
Thanks for being here and to give us some perspective from a numbers point of view here on what's at stake for the NDP this weekend. Let's start there before we actually get into the numbers. What do you think it is that New Democrats need to figure out this weekend in Edmonton?
Well, I don't know if they can figure it all out in one weekend. I think it's going to be hard for them. But I think they have to a large extent, figure out where they're going to go as they prepare not only to be an opposition party, but also as they head into 2019 and how they compete against the Liberals and the Conservatives going forward. So I think they have to figure out, obviously, is Mr. Mulcair, at least right now, the leader they want in the House to represent them. But they also, I think, have to figure out what's the party going to be about? Why would Canadians support them over the other two parties, which is, where they've been in many conventions before 2011 when they broke through. They were in a similar case. How do we get more Canadians to vote for us when in the past, maybe 1 out of 5 did, and that's the case that we saw in the last election.
Okay, let's kind of set the landscape for the context of their conversations this weekend in Edmonton. Let's go start with some of the numbers you've compiled to get a little context and perspective. Let's start with the rise and fall of the NDP, and in particular, since the election was called, right up to a few weeks ago. And let's start with the national voting intentions. And start with the question here. You asked, if a federal election were held tomorrow, which one of the following parties would you vote for in your constituency? What did you find? Let's start there with the national voting intentions.
Yeah, and so this was done in the middle of March, and you can see that the Liberals have a significant lead over the Conservatives, but the New Democrats trailing quite a bit behind both the Conservatives and the Liberals, down to 16% in our survey. And that's significantly lower than they were at the start of the federal election. You can see lots of talk about how they were entering that election in the lead. That's the case in our polling as well. But even since the last election in October, at the end of that election, they're down 4 points. So we have seen, even since that dramatic fall, a continuation of, at the national level, bad news for the New Democrats.
Let's look at some of the key geographic areas that help us tell this story. So let's look at what's happened in the province of Quebec. What do we know about the Quebec vote?
Well, Quebec, we've seen a slight uptick for the New Democrats, since January in our new numbers, but still far, far lower than we had seen for most of the federal election campaign. You can see there at the beginning of that board, almost half of Quebecers at one point during the campaign were saying they were going to vote NDP. Over the course of a week, basically, when the niqab issue broke, you saw a big drop, and they've tailed off. They're still much more competitive in Quebec than historically they've ever been, but when you're up against the Liberals polling at 45%, that's a challenge for New Democrats and all those MPs that were elected there.
And important to look at these. You can see the yellow bar down the middle of the graphic. That's election night. So you can track what happened before, what happened on voting night, and what happened to the parties after that. Let's talk about the province of Ontario. What are we seeing there?
And Ontario, similar story, although the NDP's numbers dropped earlier in the election campaign in Ontario. Since the election, they got 17% of the vote on election day in Ontario. And the numbers have continued to drop. The Liberals and the Conservatives have basically, they're basically where they were on election night. The NDP's lost a little support to the Liberals, but in the largest province in the country, you're only at 14%. That's a big, big challenge for Mr. Mulcair and the NDP as they head into this convention.
Right, that was a big black eye for them in the campaign. They lost some of those key seats that they'd managed to get in Toronto in particular. Let's look at British Columbia. What are we seeing there?
And BC, historically a good place for the New Democrats. They actually did okay, if you think coming in as third place, not too far from the Conservatives. They did okay on election night in British Columbia, but since the election in October, the Liberals have improved significantly. They're largely at the expense of both the Conservatives and the NDP, and now we have the New Democrats at 20% in British Columbia. So in all the three largest provinces in the country, the New Democrats are in third. BC's a little bit better, Quebec a little bit better than Ontario, but still, there's now no region of the country where the NDP can say they are either leading or even second, and that's a change in only 6 months for them.
Okay, so this will have all the Democrats taking Advil for the headache they got looking at these numbers. Or I should mention a brand name, taking some kind of pain medication. Let's look forward beyond election night. Let's look at where the NDP might find growth in voter support. Let's look at what you asked about accessible voters. Would you consider or not consider voting for these parties? What did people say about the NDP, and how does that compare to other parties?
Well, those few boards before, as you said, are bad news for the New Democrats. Here's some good news in that still 1 out of 2 Canadians, 50%, say they would consider voting for the NDP. And that's down slightly from the election, but still pretty good. And I think historically a good position for the New Democrats. So the benefit of their breakthrough in 2011, the benefit of being the official opposition, the benefit of almost 60% of Canadians considering them during the election is that even though right now Canadians are saying, no, I'm not going to vote NDP if an election were held, there's a lot of people across the country who are at least open to doing so.
Okay, let's talk about the leader. Tom Mulcair's job is on the line this weekend, we know that. What about Tom Mulcair and how the voters view him? I think we have a board about that, people's feelings about Tom Mulcair.
Yeah, and I think, again, not necessarily bad news. You can see that orange bar is the percentage who have a positive impression. The gray is those with a negative impression. And yes, those bars have come closer and closer together over the course of the election and after the election. But still, for a political leader in Canada to have more people view you positively than negatively, which is the case with Mr. Mulcair, that's still very good. So even though his numbers have weakened somewhat since the election, I would still say, he's viewed more positively than negatively, and that's a good thing. That's something he can take into this convention and say, more Canadians know who I am, and yes, my negatives are up, but my positives are still higher, and that's a plus for the party.
Okay, and when it comes to positive feelings that voters feel towards a leader and other leaders, not just Tom Mulcair, how does Tom Mulcair compare to his rivals?
Well, here's the bad news of him having more negatives.
What? More bad news?
More bad news for the New Democrats is that look at where Mr. Trudeau, the Prime Minister, is right now. That since the election, his numbers have kind of went through the roof. More than 50% of Canadians have a positive impression of him, and that's held steady. Doesn't mean it's going to hold like that for the next 4 years. But this is what Mr. Mulcair and the New Democrats are going to have to be competing with, is a progressive center-left leader in Mr. Trudeau, who right now has a lot of affinity among Canadians. The blue line represents Rona Ambrose. She's interim leader, so that's why the Conservative numbers are lower there.
You also asked those you surveyed whether Tom Mulcair should stay on and fight another election or step down. What did they tell you?
Well, we asked this question in November, soon after the election, and then in March, and you can see very little change. Among all Canadians, it's split right down the middle.
They won't make the decision at the convention this week, and that'll be up to the delegates.
They're not.
But it's important to know what's going on outside the room, isn't it? What other people think.
Exactly. And for Mr. Mulcair, who's trying to defend his leadership, he can point to the fact that not all Canadians think he should step away. And if we go to the next board and we actually look at how New Democrat voters think about this question, you actually see there's far more support for Mr. Mulcair. So those who voted NDP in the 2015 election, 2/3 say he should stay on. Among those who currently support the party, 7 out of 10 say he should stay on, which is interesting because that's the threshold that the president of the party, Rebecca Blakey, said would be the threshold he needs to get in order to maybe hold on to his leadership. So it's interesting that right now he's got 70% of his party supporters. And interestingly, we ask those who wouldn't vote for the NDP today but are open to it, 56% say that Mr. Mulcair should stay on. So these numbers all suggest to me there's not a whole lot of resistance in the NDP universe, the broader universe, for Mr. Mulcair staying on as leader.
When we look at, I want to take a look, I think we have it too, a brand comparison. I thought this was interesting. The NDP trails the Liberals on some of the measurements, but there's some reason to be somewhat optimistic too when you compare the two parties here, because fair to say, these are the two parties that need to fight for each other's voters.
Right.
What does this tell us?
Well, it tells us, for example, so we asked people, do these statements on the left of your screen describe each of the parties? And so what it tells me is that, again, even though the NDP's vote numbers are down, by and large, large majority believe it represents diversity. Almost 40% of Canadians think that the party's hopeful and optimistic, that it protects taxpayers. I think that's a unique position the New Democrats have not traditionally been in. But it also, I think, as a result of the campaign, has struggled. If the one that's interesting promises anything to get elected, that second line there, historically, the Liberals have been seen as the party maybe that's more willing to move around ideologically, the NDP more consistent. Now more people think the NDP is willing to promise anything to get elected than the Liberal Party. And so this is all about who the New Democrats are. Are you a conscience of Parliament? Are you a social democratic ideological party? Or one where I think Mr. Mulcair tried to move the party, and Mr. Layton too, to one that can actually win elections and be a little more moderate. Canadians reacted to that, both positively and negatively, and I think my overall assessment is the brand is not in deep trouble. The NDP brand is not. Right now they're facing simply a very popular leader and party in the Liberals, and they just have to sort of see where that goes over the next few years.
All right, all important information. Before I let you go, you're also polling on the importance of young people in the voting process in this country. What are you finding?
Well, we've got a report coming out in the next week and a half that basically shows that youth turnout went up. At least evidence suggests youth turnout went up quite a bit, and young people who voted seemingly overwhelmingly voted for the Liberals. So for the New Democrats this weekend, they also have to think about that important demographic. Traditionally didn't vote, traditionally less likely to vote. They seemingly did it this time, and they won the youth vote in 2011. They came second in 2015. So part of the questioning that has to happen is, can Mr. Mulcair himself relate to young people the same way that Justin Trudeau has? Bernie Sanders in the United States has proven you don't have to be young to connect with young voters, and that's something I think that Mr. Mulcair maybe want to communicate this weekend.
All right, great stuff. David Coletto, as always, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Peter.